Hi, Dervla.
Hey, how are you doing? Hi,
Good. How are
Cindy.
you?
I'm
Hi.
very well.
I'm so glad
Hi,
you're here.
guys. Thanks for
So what
having
time
me. I'm
is it?
excited to be with you.
What time is it in Australia?
It's 9 a.m., very respectable time
Okay,
because it's in Perth summer, starting at 5:30 is quite normal. So I'm halfway through the day already.
good. Well, good. I'm so glad. Well, we're really thrilled that you're joining us. We were just having a nice conversation about your book and how much we enjoyed it. So thanks for taking the time to chat with us.
It's my pleasure, my great pleasure. Thanks for reading.
Of course. So our very first question is a softball. Tell us how you came up with the idea for this one. And
Oh
everybody's
gosh.
read it. So it's you can talk
Okay.
all about
So
the
no
book because
spoilers.
everybody's read it. Yeah.
I suppose like every other book, it's always a couple of different things that come together. It started when I was having coffee with a friend of mine. One of these things you're supposed to be together for half an hour, and you're still sitting there 2 hours later. And we were just chatting. And my kids are still quite young. I have a 14-year-old daughter and a 12-year-old son, but her boys are older. And she has a boy just starting college. And she was talking about kind of her worries for him. Now he's a great kid, like a lovely kid, likes his sport, popular with his friends, maybe a bit young for his age. And she was just saying, everything has changed so much. Our expectations of young men in a social environment are really different. And obviously, we're both in favor of the change. But she was saying, some of it's really murky. Like consent stuff is obvious. You don't go where you're not wanted. You behave appropriately. You're kind and respectful of other people. But you throw a bunch of 18-year-olds together after a few drinks in a crowded space and a bit of enthusiasm, and it's easy to say the wrong thing or do something stupid. And if you make those kinds of mistakes 10 years ago, someone might say something to you and you might apologize and everybody would move on. But now someone takes a photograph, or maybe you're online and you stick up for a friend on social media when you really shouldn't have, and it's screen captured and sent out and spun, and this stuff follows you for a long time. So she was saying she feels like there's less room to make mistakes. And if there's one thing we know about 18-year-old boys is that they make a lot of mistakes. And it was the first time I'd really thought about it like that. I've always been conscious of the risk to young girls, and I'm still am. And that's the real danger. But I have a son too, and I just started to think as he gets older, God, I am going to be thinking about this more. And how do I teach him about, how to behave in social situations so he, stays ahead of this sort of thing. So that was on my mind. And I started to think about the difference between being a parent to a girl and a parent to a boy, and how you might think about things a little bit differently. But at the same time, here in Australia, particularly, we've been having a really major public conversation about coercive control. And we've had a series of really serious, horrendous crimes where we've had murders and murder suicides where men have killed their domestic partners, either their wives who have just left them or their girlfriends and their children. And it's been horrific. And very often in the days following the crime, there's an interview where someone puts a microphone in front of somebody's face and asks them, how do you feel about the fact that Mark from next door just killed his wife? And often the response is, he was such a good man. This was a moment of madness. And like, I really feel for the person in that situation, because when a microphone's put in front of your face and you're traumatized, you say these things, but it is so wrong to my mind, because good men can't be provoked into killing their children or their wives. Good men can't be provoked into beating someone that they supposedly love. And I think what's missing very often in that conversation is the person who's being asked that question hasn't realized, oh, I was shown the face of one person, but the person they really were to the vulnerable people in their lives was completely different. And so that was on my mind too, going into the book. And I think the combination of those things, plus what we're seeing with all the huge interest in true crime and how that's being sort of exploited online, all of those things kind of came together, and that's where the book came from. That was a very long answer, sorry.
No, that was good. I figured there had to be a variety of things. And, we've had here in the US cases like that too, and various things happening. And so it is interesting to see it explored in fiction. The social media aspect, I was so curious about that because I do think that's something that authors are starting to talk more about and incorporate into their stories. How did you decide to approach that? And was that something that you did from the beginning, or was it woven in later? How did all that work for you?
It was even interesting to me from the beginning, how these cases start and then how they become something very different in the public eye. But as I was reading around the subject, as I was writing, it just became more and more, an area of interest for me. Because look, we all know that, outrage drives attention online. We know that. We've been talking about that for a long time now. It's not a new idea. But what I was really struck by is the degree to which we're just financially incentivizing that directly, and I don't know that we necessarily recognize how much impact that's having. There are literally thousands of people who get up in the morning and they need clicks. That's how they pay their rent, at the end of the month. And they're not necessarily earning a whole hell of a lot. We hear about the really big earners, but we don't hear about everybody who's just scrubbing along, trying to be an influencer or trying to grow their following. And at the end of the day, if they're sitting down saying, okay, I'm going to talk about this new true crime case that is in the headlines, and I can either say something sympathetic and reasoned, or I can say something outrageous that suggests I know that the mom knows something. Well, I'm going to get 100 times more clicks if I say something outrageous about the mom. And then with those 100 times more clicks, I'm going to get that more engagement, and there's a chance the algorithm's going to pick me up and push me. So I'm going to say the thing about the mom. And the line is shifting constantly, because one of the things that changes our behavior is what we see around us. So it becomes so normalized, something that like 5 years ago we would all have been really shocked by. Now it's like, well, whatever. Like I saw 10 times worse than that yesterday. So big deal. So the barrier between saying outrageous things is getting, lower and lower. Again, in Western Australia, 2 years ago, a little girl, Cleo Smith, who's only 5, was taken from her parents' tent. They were camping a bit north of here in Western Australia. And in the middle of the night, she was just lifted out of the tent and taken. And her parents were completely innocent, and the police cleared them within like 24 hours of it. Now, Cleo was found a week later. She's safe and she's recovered. And she was taken by a stranger, someone who had mental health problems and drug problems. No relationship with the family whatsoever. But there was a Facebook group set up in Western Australia with tens of thousands of members. And some of the things that were said about the parents were just horrific. And they were going through the worst trauma any of us could imagine. The police had cleared them. The West Australian Premier, the most senior politician, had gone on the news and said, can you please stop targeting Cleo Smith's parents? They are entirely innocent. Police are investigating. And people didn't. And so I just think there's a breakdown of our normal social norms. When we go online, we say things we would never say in person. And the craziness of the things we say, is getting more extreme every year that goes by. So I guess I wanted to kind of shine a light on that a little bit.
Well, and I do think that is so interesting, because I think you have the first thing you were talking about, people crafting these headlines because that's how they're making their money and they want people clicking. But then you also have all these random people that it's just a side hobby for them, that are leaping into these Facebook groups or whatever else and contributing their thoughts when they know nothing about it. And that's the part. They're both very baffling to me, but the second is particularly baffling to me, because I'm like, why are they even getting involved? Like,
Why? It's so
it's
weird. I
fascinating
read around this
about it.
a lot, and there's been a lot of research about, why do we do that stuff? Why do we feel the need to do that? And, look, I don't have the answers, and I'm not a social scientist, but one of the answers I found that maybe sort of semi goes there is it talks about this evolutionary, how status is an evolutionary thing, that having status in a social group is important to us. It makes us feel good. It's important for survival. And that saying something judgmental gives us that small status boost. We say something where we have an opinion, where it's strongly held, and we think we know something about it, and we get into the group and we just land that thing there. And for a very short period of time, it makes us feel better. It doesn't last, but just it makes us for some people, it makes them feel a little bit better for a little while, and then you need to go back for more. I don't know if that's really an answer. It doesn't fully satisfy me, but that's the best I could find.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. And I think also people are more and more isolated, so they're home by themselves more, and that's how they're interacting, and they want to have a group and they want to be able to participate in the group, and sometimes that's how they feel like they're doing it. But
Yeah.
it's a shame.
I think maybe the blurring of lines too. I mean, like with reality TV, we all know it's scripted, but part of the fun of it is to sort of suspend disbelief and kind of go along with it, and then be like shocked by the fact, oh my God, I can't believe he did that turn. He was cheating. And it's really fun. Like it's social gossip, and it's kind of harmless. And the actors on reality TV, they know what they've signed up for largely. And so we sort of feel it's harmless. But then we bring in true crime into this, and it's again blurring the lines. We're sort of treating it like reality TV, but they're real people, and often it's very traumatic what they're dealing with.
Very true. Well, one of our members couldn't be here, but she had a question, so I was just going to ask. So Renata said, what was the decision-making process like for including Nina's chapter at the start of the book? And then was there any thought to put her voice again anywhere else in the story?
I love that question because it was very deliberate. I really did not want Nina to die in this book. It's very refreshing to be able to talk about this openly with you guys. I fought about that with my editors and stuff because it was just breaking my heart. I'm so tired of girls dying, you know. So I didn't want her to die, but realistically, given the story I was writing, it had to happen. And then what I wanted more than anything else was her voice to be there at the beginning, hopefully really strongly. Like I really wanted you to know her. And then I wanted you to feel her absence the rest of the way through the book. Because that's it, she's gone. And she was so vital. And I know so much more about her than appears in the book. And I want her there, but she's gone. And I wanted that sort of dissonance to be there. So I don't know if it worked or made the book better or worse, but that was what was in my mind.
Well, I'm so glad that you did have her speak at the beginning because it helped us get to know her and then feel very invested in her story. I also really hoped that she had not died. So I
Yeah,
was reading along going, please don't let her, but I understood that she
you know.
needed to. I mean, same thing you're saying. Like I would have loved
There
if
is
she
a
hadn't
whole other
died,
version of
but
this book where she's alive, by the way.
what did you
But
say?
it's
I'm
in
sorry.
fact, there's a whole other version of this
Oh,
book where she survived and she was off doing other things in those early days. But it's in the back of my computer and will never be seen, unfortunately.
really? Okay, that's interesting. So
Yeah.
where had she gone?
She'd gone to Boston. I'm just trying to remember exactly what happened. So yes. So what I can't believe I'm telling you guys is basically what happened is the night of the confrontation with Simon in the house, his father comes to the house and his father witnesses Simon assault her. And it's a pretty serious assault. And the father is very keen to cover it up. And so he sort of locks Nina in a room. She doesn't realize she's locked in initially, but he locks her in the room. And then she realizes she's really in danger. So she climbs out of the window and she runs. She ends up in Boston. She goes to her sister, who was older in this version of the book, and it was a doctor. And her sister had been helping a veteran guy who was living in sort of semi-poverty. And so they end up staying with him, and there's this whole other thing. And I was always trying to justify why she hadn't been in touch with her mother, which was the thing that made least sense. You know, okay, she's running and she's hiding, but like, why wouldn't she just make contact at least? And that was the kind of logic thing that broke me in the end that I had to acknowledge. I had explanations and reasons, but it didn't make sense. So I love that character that she was with and her older sister who existed at the time. And all of that is written and relatively polished. But yeah, I had to cut it in the end and go a different way.
Well, and as you said, I think it makes sense that she had died, but it was hard. I was hoping she hadn't.
Mm, me
And
too.
I
I
loved
struggled
the
with that.
ending. But both that Andy, I mean, I didn't love that Andy killed Simon, but the way that then Leanne swooped in, took care of it all. We were saying we need a Leanne in our lives for when something like that
Yeah.
happens. Just to come in and take care of it all. But also then when Jamie comes to the door and says, please, please tell me, please help me. And she was able to kind of do what had been done to her.
Yeah. Yeah, when that hit me years ago, I read an interview with Stephen King where he said that writing a book is not writing a book. It's like you're uncovering something that already existed. You know, you're excavating a dinosaur bone fossil, and it's all there for you. You just have to find it. And I remember listening to or reading that interview and thinking, what a load of nonsense. Of course you have to write it. You have to create it. But now I've been writing for a while. I kind of get it. You know, sometimes you feel like you just discovered something and it was always meant to be. And when that bit came to me, and I was like, well, of course, because they're the same. They just don't realize it. And, you know, they'll do anything to protect their families. And in that moment, like Leanne can see the pain and she recognized it because that was the desperate pain she was in. And so she has the empathy, but her choice is to take a risk for her and risk her family or say no. And she chooses no every time. But it's heartbreaking to me.
Well, and yeah, and I agree with all of that, that the first and foremost, but also to just turn around and do what was done to her,
Mm,
where
mm.
Jamie had said, shut the door in her face. And so I just,
Yeah,
felt like she
absolutely.
was
Jamie
like,
hadn't
okay,
hesitated.
right. So I don't want to ask all
Yeah.
the questions. Sorry. So who has a question? I would love to turn the mic over here. Nobody? Okay, well, then I'll keep going. Title and cover. So tell me, I always love to hear about how titles come about and covers. So can you talk a little bit about yours?
The title was there all along, although it was called What Happened to Lola. She was Lola all the way that I was writing it. And then I called my editor and told my editor, and she was very excited. Then she emailed me. She was like, "Oh no, we have a very wonderful writer over here called Trent Dalton, and he's a very, very successful and popular writer in Australia and writes beautiful books. And by absolute coincidence, his next book was Lola in the Mirror." And it
Oh,
was coming out a couple of months before mine, and we just kind of, where we can't have all the Lolas, so it became Nina. But nobody, like when I first sent that to, I've since left my agent, but at the time I sent him the title and he wasn't keen at all. But I went back and pitched it to him again. And I was like, no, no, look at this. This is why I think it should be this title. And then he was convinced. The cover came from him. He liked the sort of moodiness of it, and the feel of it. I think it's probably 50-50. 50% of people really love it, 50% of people not so keen. I like it a lot. I think it has that mood, even though she looks quite different to the way I picture her in my head. I think it has that sort of mood about it and the true crimey feel. So it's sort of indicative of what's going on in the story.
is the cover the same in different markets?
Yes, it's slightly different. So this is the Australian version.
Okay, so it
So
is
it's just a
similar, but
little
it's a
bit
little
brighter,
okay.
text a little bit different,
And your
and
name is on
blurbs a bit
top versus
different.
okay, yeah, I'm going back and forth
And
between
then,
copy here. I'm
yeah,
like, okay.
fair enough. And in the US, there's always the convention of a novel, which doesn't exist outside of the US. So you won't see that on the UK covers or
Oh,
Australian covers,
oh,
where
that's
it's always
interesting. So they never say a
says,
novel in Australia.
no.
Oh.
I really like it. I think it's really sweet. Like I like seeing it on the American cover, but yeah, no, it was new to me the first time I saw that on a book. I was like, why do we have that? And then it was explained to me that it's always the same when it's fiction in the US.
Yes, I'd never thought about that. That's really interesting. After all the cover conversations I've had, that's fascinating. Well, I have a quick question, totally unrelated to this book. I'm a huge fan of your Cormac Riley series.
Oh,
And when I
thank
worked
you.
at Murder by the Book, I sold it all the time and people just loved it. Are you ever going to write any more?
I haven't, this is not public, so don't tell anybody, but I'm nearly finished one.
Oh, yay. Oh, I'm
Yeah,
so happy because I was telling
I'm
people
working on it
before,
right now.
but people were slowly hopping on. I was like, that is one of my all-time favorite series. Like I still recommend it regularly to people. Like I said, when I worked at Murder by the Book, I was like, you have to read this. And people always came back and were like, it was so good. Are there more? And I was like, no, there are just these three.
Oh, thank you.
So,
That's
okay,
so
good.
nice to
Yay.
hear. That's so nice. I was last October, and like to be honest, I owe my publisher another standalone, but I just had this story and I just had to write it, so I wrote it. And so I'm just going through the second draft at the moment. It'll be interrupted a little bit because I'm just going on tour next week here in Australia. But once I get back, then I'll have finished it. So I think it'll be out probably early next year. So
Okay,
yeah, I'm
great.
excited about it.
Oh, that's
But thank
wonderful
you.
news. Well, I'm so happy. And when we were looking on Goodreads, and it looked like you have a couple like maybe short novellas that also factor in there, which I don't think
Yes.
I realized. So I'm gonna have to track those down in the
They
meantime.
were audio. So I do audio originals for Audible sometimes. And so two of them are sort of Cormac Riley related, kind of. I mean, The Roommate, it's kind of shoehorned in a bit because it's a short little mystery story. And then young Cormac is there very briefly at the very end. But The Sisters is a bit more relevant in that if you've read the Cormac Riley series, there's a female cop in that called Carrie O'Halloran. And The Sisters is when Carrie was a young cop starting out in Dublin. She's a young cop. Her sister is a young defense barrister. And sort of that natural conflict between their jobs and their living together and so on. And this first sort of case. So I really enjoyed doing that one. And that was number one in the US for about 4 weeks or 5 weeks or something. And when it came out, which is exciting. So that's those are stories I might go back to at some point. But there's too much to write, Cindy. I've got so many different things I want to work on. And it's just
Oh,
trying to get to them all.
absolutely. And you're Irish, right? You were originally
Yes.
Irish, but then you moved to Australia, correct? Okay.
Yes, we moved about almost 13 years ago. It'll be 13 years this October. Crazy.
Okay. So are you going to ever set a book in Australia?
I set one of my Audible originals here
Okay.
called The Wrong One, which just came out. No, sorry, called The Fireground. Got getting mixed up, which just came out earlier this year. I think I will. It's very possible. And I've got various ideas, so it really depends which one I go with for the next standalone. It may very well be set in Australia. There are three different story ideas. I'm all interested in all of them. Only one of those would be US based. Two of them would likely be Australian. So, but my editor is very open to me setting them my New York editor is very open to me setting them anywhere now, which is lovely for me because it gives me a bit more flexibility. So I think possibly the next full length one after the Cormac might be an Australian novel.
Okay, that's exciting. I always my parents lived in Sydney for 4 years, so I always love things
Ah,
set in Australia and enjoy reading things set there. So I was
that's
curious. She
awesome.
lived there
Sydney's a
now.
beautiful city.
Yeah, it was. It was really fun to visit them. Well, let's talk a little bit more about the format in this one. We talked about Nina at the front, but how did you always decide to tell the story mainly through the parents and then Matthew, or I guess all through the parents and Matthew, and alternating their perspectives? Was that how you started?
Always alternating the parents for sure. Matthew's role, he was always there, but in a slightly different way through the book. And then I sort of decided the way I saw it is the parents start off in a particular place, and then this bomb goes off in the middle of their lives, and they each take a step. And that first step, while it might be in Leanne's case, it's a bit nutty, she breaks into the house, but it's reasonable in the circumstances. And then they take a second step, and then a third step, and then a fourth step. And by the end of the week, I think if any of them had a chance to step outside themselves, they would just not recognize themselves. They would be like, how on earth did I get from there to there in a week? This makes no sense. But I sort of see them, they're almost in a parallel universe because of the trauma and because the police aren't telling them much, particularly Anne and Andy. They're not hearing a whole lot. So it doesn't feel like much is happening. So it's like both sets of parents slip into this world that is almost our world, but slightly beside our world. They're in this little box. Whereas the police chapters to me are like almost like a metronome against what's happening with the parents. And that's the more normal timeline. The investigation is proceeding normal, it's just a more normal environment and the pace is more normal. And I wanted that as I'm sure it doesn't feel this way at all when you're reading the book, but in my head, the way I was thinking about it is this is sort of the a normal beat of time punctuating what's happening with the parents. And it just provides this sort of spine of the book while the parents, and a sort of a, maybe I wanted you to know that I knew that what the parents was doing, what they were each doing was a little crazy and becomes very crazy at certain points. It wasn't that I wasn't aware of the fact that they were each taking more and more extreme action that was deliberate. And I wanted to contrast that with the more normal timeline of the police. Does that make any kind of sense?
Absolutely. I kept thinking throughout the whole thing, what would I have done? And obviously, the more tired you get, the more stressed out. They're not eating. All this stuff is happening out in the world. I'm sure they were all unraveling. But as you were writing, did you really have to think long and hard about what you would have done in that situation?
Absolutely. And I mean, when Leanne breaks into the house in the first place, like a couple of people have said to me, God, that was a bit crazy. Why didn't she just, phone the police or whatever? And I'm thinking, I would have done 10 times more. Like if I thought there was any chance my daughter was sitting on, at the bottom of the stairs in somebody's house, there is nothing that would stop me getting in there. I couldn't care if I'm breaking 5,000 laws, but personalities differ. That one, no problem. Some of the other decisions, Rory's decision, when he realizes the truth and he moves her, I don't know. I mean, he tries to convince himself that it was an accident. I think there's a part of him that knows from the beginning that it wasn't. And so what he's choosing to do there, he's just desperately trying to hold on to the life that existed before all this. He's not ready to accept that life is gone and will never come back. And he takes this action. And I think, if he hadn't been arrested, I think he would have unraveled anyway, because I think he was going to be deeply traumatized by that moment forever. But maybe I could see it happening that it's not like you get to sit down with the therapist and talk it through, or even take 3 days to just think. You're there and it's the middle of the night and you're exhausted and the clock is ticking and you have no time. And I think maybe I could see that happening in those circumstances.
And we were talking about this before you hopped on. You just desperately want to believe your child. Simon's like, it was an accident. And every fiber in your being is going to want to believe that, even if you like
Absolutely.
Rory clearly probably did know that it was not an accident. But if they're telling you that, you want to hold on to that.
Because what's the alternative? You know,
Right.
like this boy that you love, and the love doesn't die because this has happened. The love's been there forever. It's part of your, it's there in you on a cellular level, you know, and you know your child. Like, I think that we always think they must have known on some level, but I don't think that people do. I think that we make allowances for the people that we love, and we see the best in them. And when they make mistakes, we have, well, that's because he's insecure, or, you know, whatever. We have reasons. We're very rarely look with a very clear eye at the people we love, particularly our kids. So he loves his son, and the love hasn't died, even though he now realizes this has happened. He absolutely convinces himself in the beginning that Simon's telling the truth. And when he begins to realize, when he sees her and realizes it isn't true or can't be true, he's not ready to look at it. I think in 3 or 4 days, if that time had been available to him, he would have, the reality of it would have begun to seep through, and he would have begun to accept it, and maybe he would have made better decisions, but he didn't have that kind of time.
And I also think as a parent, you feel like it reflects on you. And so, I've raised this child that is a killer. And so I think in addition to the relationship with Simon, they're thinking, are we that bad at parents? And I don't want
Yeah.
people to think we're that bad at parents. You know what I mean? I think that, and
Yeah.
as we just talked about, people judge like crazy.
Oh
So,
my God, they're so
as
fast to
soon
judge.
as,
What
right, it
did you
comes
guys
out.
think? Do you guys think that Simon was the way he was because he was born that way, or do you think he was the way he was because of the way he was raised, or a bit of both? What did you think?
I actually was really torn because I am very fascinated by the whole nature nurture arguments, and I really couldn't decide because I feel like at times his dad in particular felt detached from him, and so I was like, is was he not loved enough? Does he have some kind of um, you know just lack of empathy or anything like that too? But yeah, I went back and forth a lot with that, so I still don't know.
I'm glad it made you think about it. That's very good. I
That's
have my
great.
own thoughts, but I don't ever feel like it's like, I feel once the book goes, then it's your book, and you know, you guys have to take what you want from it and think about it the way you want to think about it. So it's not like there's one right answer in my head. It's just I have my idea about it, but Simon feels almost real. So it's like I have a theory, but how do I know, you know?
Well, and I also wondered, and again, when I was looking back through the book today, was he always that way? I mean, and Nina just didn't recognize it, or did he get much more controlling the longer they dated? And I was curious what everybody thought about that too. And what you thought, Dervla. Like, did you think he was always that way?
I think he was. I think he was, but he got worse for sure. And I think what prompted the getting worse, like he was always quite manipulative and very self-involved and had a strong sense of entitlement. And like on the nature nurture thing, my theory is that he, you know, there was something. There are certain characteristics, his ability to feel emotion, that were dangerous from the beginning. And I think being raised in that home where his mom was acting a role in a way, and really very much sort of designing herself around her husband, he sort of, what Simon took from that was a sense of entitlement, that he should have the same. And I think then as he got older, and he himself and Nina, they you know, they went separate ways in terms of college, and she was trying to be independent, that he really did not respond well to that because he wanted to control her. He felt the sense of ownership, and he should be in charge, and she should just, you know, hop. And when she, for very reasonable reasons, wasn't doing that, the anger, you know, and the resentment started to build. And he became violent with her, and then the violence just kind of grew over time.
Well, and we haven't talked about that either. That one of her friends clearly knew she had bruises on her body and didn't speak up. And then also the controlling, like when he had her made her put him on FaceTime and put it in her pocket while she was going about. I mean, I was like, oh, how did you come up with some of those ideas?
Well, I guess some of it's just intuitive. I mean, the Facebook thing, I hadn't, it's not like anybody had told me that that was their direct experience, but it felt right for that kind of person. And it was very similar to other things that I have read about. And you know, I don't know if it would be similar in where you guys are living, but in Ireland when I was growing up, there was a very much a closed door culture where things that happened within families were just, that was people's business, and you didn't, it wasn't your business, you know. And when people heard rumors and stories and they knew about things, they didn't do anything. And like I found it very distressing as I grew up learning about this stuff. When the child sex abuse scandal happened in Ireland and we heard everything that had been happening, I mean, in all the newspapers and all the interviews, just the answer kept coming back. We didn't know it was happening. If we'd known it was happening, we would have stepped in, we would have done something to prevent it. And all I was thinking is when I was a little kid and my brothers misbehaved, you know, the joke was, if you don't behave yourself, you'll be sent to the Christian Brothers, you know? And like, you weren't saying that because it was such a great place to go. Like people knew that being with the Christian Brothers was not a good place. And a lot of these small homes were in little villages and towns, and the kids would be walked down to mass on a Sunday and they were suffering from malnutrition. You know, they were badly dressed. Like anybody looking at that little group of kids being walked down to mass would have known things weren't right. But at the same time, the people who had done nothing were the people of my parents' generation, whom I love, who are good people. They're not bad people, they care. And yet they didn't do anything. And I could never wrap my head around that. But I think there were two big reasons why people didn't. One was this whole concept of othering, that as soon as these kids went in the doors of those homes, they were seen as different. And there's just something about the human mind where we're able to remove ourselves a little bit. If it's not my child or my child's friends or kids I strongly relate to, I can sort of step back emotionally and protect myself from it and not see it clearly. It's like a survival thing. Otherwise, we'd all go crazy every time we see some terrible thing about Syrian refugees and we wouldn't be able to live, you know? So we just kind of remove ourselves. That's one thing. And the other thing is there's just this very strong thing in Irish culture of you mind your business. You mind your business. It's not your business. You know, we don't get involved. And I think that's changed a lot. But absolutely, when I was growing up, people knew about domestic violence situations. 100%. Oh, well, we know about Mrs. Murray, and she's not going to be seen now because her husband was out late on Thursday night, so we won't see her for a week because she won't want to come into public because her bruises. Nobody did anything. Police didn't do anything. Normal people in the community didn't do anything. And I think that still happens all the time today. We just aren't sure enough. Like, you know, in this case, Nina's friend is just not, Nina denies it. She is almost certain she knows, but does she know enough? And who would she talk to? And like, is it her business? And so we don't do anything, you know?
No, I think that's right. I just hate that.
Yeah, me
You
too.
know, somebody knew and could have done something, but it is hard. It's hard to be a teenager. So, and to come forward with something like that.
Yeah. It's just the murky stuff. You know, it's never the black and white, clear, perfect example where it's like, oh, I saw him do it and now I can take action and I'm in a position of, you know, where I'm secure and I can take action. It's very rarely like that, I think. It's always the muddy stuff.
I think that's right. And I think it's trickier when it's a married couple and you've got, the marriage and but when it's somebody younger like that, you think, oh, I wish that, they're still living with their parents and things like that.
Yes.
Wish
Yeah.
that something could happen. I mean, you wish it could happen all the time, but in a situation like
Oh my
this, I
God,
think
yeah.
it would be
But she
easier
was
for it to.
protecting him. And I think that's what happens so often, you know, that young girls and they're embarrassed themselves, but they're also like, oh no, if I tell people, they're not going to understand. They're going to think he's a really bad guy. But they don't know him the way I do. And it was just a moment of weakness. And it's because he was upset about rugby or whatever, you know, there's always an excuse or a reason. And like, it's tempting to see what I really wanted to show with Nina is she's not weak. There's no weakness in her. What there is so much love. And that's the tragic part. Like that's the way in, that she's got such a big heart and he abuses that. And she would have walked away if she was given the chance, but he stopped
Yeah,
her.
she should have just waited. I was like, oh, girl, you can't walk away while you're out in the middle of nowhere. You have to fake it
Yeah,
until the next
be
day,
smart
get
about it.
home, and then
Yeah,
walk away, But yes,
yeah,
then you wouldn't have a book. So,
yeah.
um, I have one last question, but before I just want to make sure nobody else has questions. I feel bad. I don't want to be hogging the whole time.
Sorry, Angie had sent me a direct message. I don't know if it was an accident, but Angie said, I loved the book and the multiple point of view format kept me from allying with with my one other than Nina. As an author, is there a character you hope the reader would empathize with? That's from Angie.
In this book, other than Nina, I kind of feel like with all of the parents, I hope there's a moment of empathy, not necessarily consistently through the book. You know, I'm not saying you need to get to the end and think Jamie's a great person or whatever, or Rory's a great person. But I hope that at different points, there would be moments of empathy for all of them. like I can see Jamie's flaws a mile away, but I like her hustle in a kind of way. She has this really messed up way of looking at the world, but given her messed up way of looking at the world, she then kind of takes it on, and I like that about her. And she loves her son. You know, she really does, and it destroys her what happens. So I hope there's a moment of empathy for her. Even Rory, certainly Andy and Leanne. And again, none of them are perfect, but I just hope at different moments that there's enough there that you would feel empathy for them.
Kristen was talking about that you were saying you had empathy for Jamie, and
Yeah, I definitely felt at times that, you know, I liked Jamie. I felt that she was a good person. But then she made decisions that you just wanted to strangle her.
Yeah.
Um, you know, and I think she was in a hard place. You know, she knew that her marriage was not what she thought it would be, and was not going to necessarily last. Um, but in this situation, she was trying to do what was right for her son. And even through that, she wasn't getting the full picture. She wasn't getting all the answers. Her husband was holding back, and that wasn't helping matters because she didn't know what she could do. And even Simon, she knew Simon was lying to her. So she really was kind of caught between a rock and a hard place. But then, you know, she wasn't being, you know, a good mom to another mom. So like, you know, there were those moments where, you know, you wanted to like her and you felt that empathy for her, but then she turns around and does things and you're like, what?
Yeah, up to a point. I guess
So
they're all not likable at certain points as well, and it's a kind of a risk when you write a book like that. I mean, the classic way to do it is choose a protagonist, and this is your sympathetic character, and they might be flawed, but they should be, and I don't mean that they have to be like lovable all the way through, but that there's something in them that you stick with them. And whereas that is not how I wrote this book, which is a risk, because you guys could have read it and gone, Jesus, I hate all of these people, they're the worst.
I loved it though. I loved the way you wrote it because I'm not a mom. I have many, many nieces and nephews, but I still felt everything that they were going through. Like that came through so well.
Thank you.
And I felt that each of the parents, like they were just so multi-dimensional, that it really made you think. And you know, I would do probably, well, maybe not what Rory did, but almost everything else that all of them did for all of my nieces and nephews. So
yeah. Oh, thank you. That's so nice to hear. I can't even tell you. Thanks a million. I haven't really talked about this book much yet at all because everything kicks off next week. And so it's been really nice to be able to talk it over with you guys. And you've been so kind about it. So thanks a million.
oh yeah,
Really
it's fun to have
appreciate
it. Jada, did you have a question too?
Yes, I just wanted to ask about the setting because I loved how vivid it was with with the snow and the hiking, and I just wondered how you chose to set it there. And have you been to Vermont? Is that somewhere you love to go, or?
Oh gosh, it's so ridiculous. Honestly, when I decided on Vermont, I'd never been to Vermont. I just always thought it looked so beautiful. I spent time in Maine, but not Vermont. And I have a friend who sets all of her books in New York and Paris, and all of her research trips are to New York and Paris. And I thought, sod this, I'm not setting any more books in Galway. I want to set the places I want to go to. So I decided on Vermont, not really looking up the flights, because it's 4 flights to get to Vermont from Perth. So I wrote the book and I researched online a lot, you know, did a lot of research online, put my little Google Maps guide down and walked around and everything. But going there then, once I had the first draft down, made a huge difference, because there's nothing like experiencing a place for yourself, and some of your perceptions are so wrong. It's not the stuff that, you know, the geography stuff is easily dealt with, but it's more the cultural things. My perception of Vermont from here was that it was, you know, a sort of wealthy weekenders type place, because it's stunningly beautiful. It's very close to Boston. Some of the homes are obviously very expensive, but being there, I realized it's actually 2 cultures. Yes, so you've got your very expensive weekenders, but you've also got a very different culture of people who are like, I want to be as far from a big city as possible. And I'm here because it's remote and I want a very different lifestyle. And that was really cool to get that side of things and be able to kind of put more of that in the book. So look, I loved going there. I contacted a guy called Peter who does kind of backwoods camping and hiking and guiding and stuff. So the plan was that I'd do a couple of days hiking with Peter, and we did that. But actually, he also just drove us around, and we just talked a lot. And just the chatting and asking him every question I could think of, and him saying things that I would not have thought to ask, just really helped. So it's one of the great joys of writing books, is to be able to set them in really interesting places and then get to go and visit them. You know, I definitely want to keep doing that, because it's just a joy. My sister came over from Dublin as well, which made it extra fun. She came around with me.
And Angie had asked the same question, how you decided on Vermont. So that was perfect, Jada. So does anybody else have a question before we're done? So I just wanted to ask what you've been reading or what you recommend, because I always love to hear what authors are reading, because I learn about books that I'd never know about.
Oh, I have a couple of, well, I just read S.A. Cosby's book. I think it's All the Sinners Bleed. Is that what it's called? Oh my God. Like blew my mind. I mean, just unbelievable. Like the talent and the control and the anger, and I'll read everything he'll ever write for the rest of my life, for sure. So that's a winner. I've just started a book by an Australian author called Danuka Mackenzie, and she writes a crime series that's set in Australia. I'm not sure if you guys would have come across her yet, but I've just started her new one, and she's very talented. So I'm just into chapter 1 of that, but really enjoying it.
Her name is Danuka Mackenzie.
Danuka Mackenzie.
Okay, I haven't heard of her. Good, I'll look that one up.
Yeah, she's very, very good. And I've also just finished, which is something I read every year, Cal Newport's Deep Work, because whenever I'm trying to get myself back into there's so many distractions from writing with, writers are expected to be on social media now. So there's social media, but there's also all the promotional stuff that goes into a build up to a book, which starts 3 months out, 4 months out as a writer, and then builds, then you go into full on tour mode, and then you come back. And I just find I get very distracted, and you can't be in that mindset when you're writing. And Cal Newport's book on deep work, I read it once a year, every year, just helps me reset my habits and get back into a certain way of living and thinking that is conducive to writing. So those are my recent reads.
Okay, those are fabulous. Thank you. And I'm happy to have a new Australian author to track down.
Pleasure.
Well, thank you so much, Dervla. We really appreciate it. We can't wait to see your book make it out into the world and see everybody talking about it. And this was so much fun.
Oh, it was lovely to talk to you guys. Thank you so much for taking the time to read and to talk about my book. It means a lot. So thanks, guys. And thank you, Cindy, for having me.
Absolutely. Bye. Thanks, everybody.
Thank
Bye,
you.
guys.